Hello, this is Steve Buoniconti from SOA Consulting Services, continuing our Angular 4 tutorial on forms. This is the second part of the template-driven forms presentation, and we're going to talk about some code examples and go through each one of them, showing you the nice features of Angular 4 when it comes to template-driven forms. So let's take a look at our first example. I generated a forms template-driven project using Angular CLI with WebStorm. WebStorm created a bunch of files that are useful for my project, and an Angular CLI-JSON which describes the name of my project, the index.html file that I'm using, my main.ts driver, and other attributes which might be of interest. The root directory, etc. Okay, so let's look at the index.html. We have an app root, which renders loading at first, but this app root is an Angular 4 application. The main TS is a driver which bootstraps my app module. My app module is located in the app directory, and there is an environment resource which is loaded to determine whether we're running in production or not. And if we are running in production, we enable production mode. Okay, so let's look at our app module. Our app module uses the forms module, and it uses two custom components. One is an app component, and one is a directive. Now notice we bootstrap the app component in the module, but we declare two custom components, and we import the browser module and forms module, and we have no providers. So let's go to our app component and see what's going on in the app component. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, let me do this. Let me start my project. Okay, so the app root selector is part of this component, and we have a template and a styles URL. The styles sheet shows some colors of my div tag and my span tag. The template defines a form. Now, the form has a pound f equals ng form, and that's basically exporting the variable f as the ng form so I could use f in my template. It says SN number and is an input tag. I name the input tag. I use ng model to map this form control to the HTML element, and I also use an attribute here called SSN. SSN appears to be a validator because in my span tag, if there is an error with this with this selector and this validator, I render the string SSN is invalid. So let's go back to the component. There's nothing going on, nothing too much going on here. We just have a template. The template basically is using a validator, and it validates this particular input attribute. Let's go look at the directive. First, let's see how our compile is going. Okay, let's go look at the directive. Now, the directive code imports a directive from Angular Core, imports form control and ng validators from forms, and it defines a function called SSN validator, which takes the input of a form control. It looks at the value, it matches it against an expression, and if it's valid, it returns null, else it returns true. The directive that we're declaring basically says, I want to use SSN validator as an attribute. And then what I do is I define it to be a provider. I provide this SSN validator as this ng_validators provider. And then I export the class SSN validator directive. So what it's going to do, it's going to, when I list it as this attribute here, the validator itself will get the handle of the form control. Now notice the ng model attribute of the HTML input element is what makes some of this possible. That maps it to a form control, and the form control is read inside this function. And we use this function to determine whether it's a valid SSN number. Now notice the syntax here. f.form.has_error. If this were true, then this would be false, and hidden would be false. So this shows when we return true. It's a little bit confusing. The function validator returns a JSON object, and the JSON object is used in some way. So here I'm returning SSN is true. I'm returning the error object, which has SSN to true, which basically says, yes, I have an error. Okay, so let's take a look at the sample code real quick. In action. Okay, so basically what's getting rendered here is okay, so we have the app root component in this light blue. The web page is in turquoise. And now I have an opportunity to type a number to get rid of the validation error. And notice as if I add another character, it's invalid again. So that's really all we wanted to show with this particular example. So once again, you got to introduce a directive to implement the validator. However, there are some built-in validators where you don't have to do any coding, and we'll go through some of those examples. Okay, so let's switch here. Let me first see what I have here as far as forms. Okay, let's look at the submit one. And let's start that up right now so we don't have to wait for that. And let's go into the code for submit. Okay, once again, I use Angular CLI to generate the project. I call the project form template driven submit because I'm going to be submitting some data. We're going to be looking at the JSON value. And I have an index.html, a main.ts, and I don't have any directive here. I have just a simple little example that I want to show you. Okay, so index has app root. The main.ts bootstraps app module. App module is here. Here I have a root app component, and I include some other things, directives, forms module. Oh, it seems like I don't need a directive. I'm just going to remove that temporarily. And I use a forms module. And so my declaration has my root app component, and I know it's my root because I'm bootstrapping it. And then I import the forms module, and I have no providers. And then I export my app module. Okay, now my app component is in app.component. So let's take a look at that. Okay, of course, the root component has the app root selector. My template is external, my style sheet is external, and I export the class app component, and I implemented an onSubmit function. Okay, now let's go. Before we take a look at that, let's go look at the template real quick. Okay, so basically what I have is a form, #f equals ng form. So this is the variable which represents my form value. And on a submit event, I invoke the onSubmit function of the component, and I pass in the f.value, and I also pass in the form f. I have a username input field. I name it username. There's a built-in required attribute. I put an ng model there because I have to put an ng model in all my form fields that I want to be grabbed out of this form when I create my JSON object being sent to the back end. So hash f equals ng form is a way to define the variable f as the form, but ng model is a way to say this attribute's part of the object, the form object. This attribute's part of the form object. And I also want this one. You have a button submit, and on that event we invoke this function. So let's take a look at the implementation of this function. Again. Okay, here I pass in the form data. Here I'm passing in the form. And I've done that for two reasons. One is the form data can be logged as the JSON object. The form, you could invoke these different properties to determine whether the form is pristine. That means you haven't modified anything on the form yet. It's dirty. There's some fields that are modified. Or it's valid. Well, in this case, and we're logging the fact that whether it's valid or not. So let's take a look at our example. And let me see whether this whether I should do this. Okay. I usually use Google, but I'll use IE right now. Okay. So username. So let's see what happens when we submit. The form is pristine. None of the fields have been touched. The form is dirty. It's not. We haven't entered any data yet. The form is valid. False. Why is it false? I put a required attribute on this username. Let's go back and take a look at it. This was required. And I could use some built-in attributes here like minimum length and things like that. I just want to give you a simple example. Okay, now let's type in a username. Let's submit. Pristine is false. I've changed some data. It is dirty because I've changed in that input field. And it is valid because my required field is entered. And let me just go through, and here I'm printing out my object using the console, and I'm showing this JSON object with my information. So let me just do this. Okay, it's not pristine, it's not dirty, it is valid, and here's my object. Don't do this at home, never log your password in the console. But it gives you a good idea of how convenient it is to just take form data and pump it into a method and be able to do operations on it and log it. It's a very simple thing to do. And like I said, some of the validations are very simple too. I have required minimum length, maximum length, different attributes I could use. But if I wanted to do something a little bit more complex, then it breaks down immediately. Like if I wanted to confirm the password with the password, I would have to create an equal validator. Okay, so let's move on to the next example. Let me go into, let's say forms template-driven validation. Let me start that. Let me close this. Okay, now I have a forms template-driven validation example. Okay, I named it Forms Template-Driven Validation when I created the project using Angular CLI within WebStorm. I have an index, a main.ts file. My index still is very simple, using the app root. My main.ts, unfortunately not formatted. But once again, it imports the app module and bootstraps it. The app module declares app component equal validator director and SSN validator director. And it includes several things. This obviously is not needed. It bootstraps the app component. So this is our root component. Okay, so let's take a look at app component. App component is here. Okay, and it is a class with an onSubmit function. And the onSubmit function takes the form value, and a boolean is form valid. And if it is valid, then it logs the form value to the console. Obviously is including these things which are not needed here. And we'll find out. Okay, so we're looking at the form now. Okay, so this form exports the form as an F variable. It has an ng submit event, which it invokes the onSubmit of the component. It passes the value and whether the form is valid. Notice how convenient this is. The template-driven form has validations that are done, and the fact of if one of those validations fail, the form is not valid. If they both pass, the form is valid, and we could pass that result back to the component, whether it's valid or not. This no validate tells the web browser not to validate. Angular is going to do its own validation. So I have username here. A username. This name is required. ngModel says map it to the form. It's part of my form, and it is required. I have an input named Social Security number. It is part of my model, and there's a validator which I'm using this attribute to point to its validator. Now notice I need the ngModel to say it's going to be part of this value. And then I use an ngModel group, and I group together the passwords group. I call it passwords group, and it's the password and confirm password grouped together. This particular JSON value is going to have attributes: username, SSN, and something called a password group, which is an embedded object which has password and pconfirm. So notice I also display errors next to the fields when there is an error. This will show a required error on username if it exists. If username has a required error, I will show username is required. If SSN has an error with the SSN validator, we will write SSN is invalid. The same thing with the subgroup, with the passwords group. I have a minimum length requirement here. I say the minimum length has to be 5. If that condition is not satisfied on this password group for this attribute within that group, state that the password is too short. And also I have an equal validator on the password group saying that the passwords must be the same. Okay, so the HTML is pretty straightforward, although there's a lot of little syntax here you have to understand. Before well, let's take a look at the directives. We have the SSN validator, which was the same as the last example. It gets past the form control. We look at the value, make sure it matches this particular pattern, and if it doesn't, we return a JSON object as the error object. Once again, the selector, the left square bracket says an attribute called SSN is how you use it, and also we define the class that we're using as the provider. The equal validator let's see, let's take another quick look on how we use that. We use it here at a group level on a div tag. So this group groups two inputs with the name password and pconfirm. So when we look at the equal validator, we have to pass in something called a form group. because that is what this NG model group is mapping to. So we get the keys, and notice we get the keys of the value. And we put the first element in something called first, and we put the rest of the elements in something called rest. Now, we only have 2 attributes in our group, but the number of attributes can grow if we wanted to. So this is just exhibiting using some of the rest operator, even though as we go through every single value in the rest of the form group, there's only one other element. Okay, so for each element in rest, we take the value and we compare that value to the value of first. And if they're equal, it's valid. And so it will return null, saying we're valid. And once again, you got the equal selector with the left square bracket, which says use it as an attribute, and you have a provider, which says use the equal validator as your NG validators, and you have your class. Okay, let's just take a look one more time at the template. Passwords group, NG model group, and we're using the attribute equal here. Its goal is to look at the elements in the group and determine that they're equal, or more generically, we have to determine that this second element is the same as this first element. So we passed in a value with the left curly bracket and said it's of type form group. Instead of passing in a form group and getting the value of it, we used a TypeScript notation to say, give me the value of that form group attribute, which is of type form group. And we used it in the function. Now we know form group has a group of attributes, so we use this object.keys to iterate through, and we take all those keys and we spread them into this array of values, and that's called destructuring, right? So we took something of some object and we basically said, oh, put the first element in first and put the rest, using this triple notation, into this. And this could have a number of elements in it, but really it just has the second element in it. and then we iterate through every single one to make sure the value is the same as the first. And then we return that it's valid. Okay, so let's see some of these things in action. I think, let me just, please let me submit. Okay, so let's go back and see what we were logging. Okay, so it really basically was just showing us, it was just basically showing us the JSON object which is getting logged only if it was valid. So I guess I was a little confused. I should have so let's just clean this out here, and let's remove one of these and try to submit. Okay, so at this point you're trying to figure out, did we submit the object or did we not submit the object? So let's just go back here and let's log. I don't know if this is going to take effect, but we'll try. So it took effect. Turns out that np start is running ng serve, and that's running the Webpack development server to give us some dynamically determine events happening in the browser, and it would recompile our code, etc. Sometimes it doesn't always work. Okay, so let's do this. OnSubmit is called. Okay, we have a password group, password and confirm. And let's try to just change something here. SSN is invalid. OnSubmit is called, it's just not logging anything. Okay, so that's the only thing I want to discuss with the examples. They were very simple examples, but we demonstrated several different things which are some value. Okay, so stay tuned for the next tutorial. We'll talk about reactive forms and go through all the reactive form examples that you might need to see.